The horizon seemed to bow under the weight of the Ascension Spire, its tether vanishing into the cobalt sky. From the window of the shuttle, I couldn't tell where the ground ended and the heavens began. The spire's base was anchored to a sprawling complex, a glittering expanse of metal and glass that spanned miles across the equatorial plane. The city built to support it, Ascension Complex, buzzed with activity, a technological anthill teeming with workers, engineers and tourists who had come to gawk at humanity's latest monument to ambition. The closer we drew to the landing pad, the more my chest tightened. I wanted to tell myself it was awe, some vestigial pride in a project I'd poured years of my life into. But deep down, I knew. It was dread. I'd arrived earlier than most of the passengers, a practical necessity given my role as the lead systems engineer. Hensley Dynamics had wanted someone aboard who could troubleshoot if things went wrong. Someone they could point to if things went catastrophically wrong. I'd fought tooth and nail against being selected for the maiden voyage, but in the end, my arguments fell on deaf ears. "You're the face of the Spire's technical triumphs," Hensley had said with a practiced smile. "This is your legacy." Legacy. The word rattled in my head as the shuttle doors opened. Legacy felt like an epitaph for someone who knew too much about the compromises they'd made along the way. I collected my gear and disembarked, greeted by an official who escorted me to a private tram bound for the central facility. Everything here ran with precise coordination. No one had time for small talk, which suited me just fine. As the tram sped along its magnetic rail, I stared out the window at the base of the spire. Its structure was a marvel, a ribbon of carbon nanofiber composite, stronger than steel and lighter than air, tethered to an orbital station thousands of kilometers above. It was supposed to make space travel accessible to everyone, a bridge to the stars. But as with most things humanity built, the price of progress had been paid in lives. Workers had died during the construction phase, and while their names were etched into a monument near the visitor center, I doubted the tourists lingering there gave them more than a passing glance. By the time I reached the main facility, the sun was beginning to set. The spire seemed to catch the dying light, its surface glowing like a thread of molten gold. Inside, the complex buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos I'd grown used to over the years. Technicians barked orders, engineers pored over diagnostics, and executives in tailored suits stalked the halls with the self-importance of people who'd contributed nothing but money. In the briefing room, Gregory Hensley himself was waiting. The billionaire looked exactly as I remembered. Silver hair meticulously combed, his tailored suit as sharp as the smile he wore when cameras were pointed his way. He extended a hand as I approached, and I shook it reluctantly. "Simon," he said, his voice warm but calculated. "It's good to see you again. Excited about tomorrow?" "Thrilled," I said, deadpan. "Have the final diagnostics come in?" Hensley waved a hand dismissively. "All green across the board. The climber is ready, and so are we." I didn't trust green across the board. I'd seen too many systems pass initial checks only to fail spectacularly under stress. But I held my tongue. Hensley didn't care about my concerns. He cared about optics. As far as he was concerned, this launch was already a success. The Spire was a monument to his vision, his empire. What were a few minor risks compared to that? Hensley clapped me on the shoulder and steered me toward the adjacent room, where the other passengers had gathered for a pre-launch dinner. "Come on," he said. "You'll want to meet the rest of the team." The team was a curated ensemble of individuals chosen as much for their public appeal as for their qualifications. There was Dr. Lionel Koresh, the renowned astrophysicist whose work on orbital mechanics had been instrumental to the Spire's success. He was sitting at one end of the table, engrossed in conversation with Anya Bennett, the investigative journalist Hensley had invited to document the ascent. Across from them sat George Doyle, a construction foreman who'd overseen the Spire's assembly, and Trip Weston, a brash test pilot who looked like he'd just stepped out of a commercial for high-performance spacecraft. Mason Huntley, the ex-Special Forces operative, lingered near the wall, observing the room with a calm detachment that made my skin crawl. Hensley introduced me as the mastermind behind the Spire's technical systems, a title that felt more damning than complimentary. The others greeted me with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Koresh was polite but aloof. Bennett's handshake was firm and appraising, and George's grip was so strong it made my knuckles pop. Tripp flashed me a cocky grin and asked if I designed the Spire to handle his need for speed. Huntley merely nodded. The dinner was as awkward as I'd expected. Koresh and Bennett debated the ethical implications of the Spire, with Bennett questioning whether its benefits outweighed the risks. George chimed in occasionally, offering pragmatic insights that Koresh dismissed with a wave of his hand. Tripp tried to keep the mood light, but his jokes fell flat. Huntley remained silent, his eyes darting from one person to the next. Hensley, of course, dominated the conversation. He spoke in sweeping terms about humanity's future among the stars, peppering his speech with buzzwords like paradigm shift and game changer. I tuned him out, my attention drifting to the spire visible through the panoramic window. It towered above us like a celestial sword, its base anchored firmly in the earth while its tip disappeared into the night sky. For a moment, I felt something close to awe. Then I remembered the shortcuts we'd taken to get it built, and the awe curdled into something bitter. The next morning, I was up before dawn, my nerves too frayed to allow for sleep. The passengers gathered in the operations center, where a team of technicians walked us through the climbers' systems and safety protocols. The cabin was vacuum-sealed and pressurized, with enough oxygen and rations to sustain us for several days in the unlikely event of an emergency. Unlikely, they said, as if saying it often enough would make it true. As we donned our flight suits, the atmosphere shifted. The banter from the night before was gone, replaced by a tense quiet. Even Tripp seemed subdued as he adjusted the straps on his harness. Huntley stood apart from the group, his face set in a grim mask. Bennett fiddled with her recording equipment while Koresh muttered equations under his breath. George was the only one who seemed unaffected, his calm demeanor unshaken as he helped a technician secure his helmet. The climber was waiting for us on the launch platform, its reinforced doors open like the jaws of some mechanical beast. Hensley gave a short speech, flanked by cameras that broadcast his every word to millions of viewers worldwide. I tuned him out again, my focus on the climber's interior. It was polished and orderly, its walls lined with diagnostic screens and emergency supplies. The observation windows dominated the cabin, offering an unbroken view of the Spire's ascent path. When Hensley finally finished, the technicians ushered us inside. The doors sealed behind us with a pneumatic hiss, and a voice over the intercom began the countdown. I strapped myself into a seat near the central console, my stomach churning as the final seconds ticked away. For better or worse, the journey had begun. The climber began its ascent. The cabin disconnected from its anchors and engaged the Spire's electromagnetic track. For a second, there was an unsettling stillness, as if we were suspended in time, waiting for something to go wrong. Then came the whir of the cabin's internal systems, steady and mechanical, a reminder that everything was functioning as it should. Gregory Hensley, seated across from me, leaned back and grinned. "Smooth so far," he said, addressing no one in particular. His voice carried an air of triumph, as if the Spire's success were a foregone conclusion. The rest of us exchanged brief glances but said nothing. It was too early for celebration. The cabin's interior was sparse but functional. Diagnostic screens hung on the walls, displaying a constant stream of data: altitude, velocity, cabin pressure, and power output. A central console housed the manual controls, though they were largely ceremonial. The Spire's systems were designed to operate autonomously, with human intervention required only in extreme emergencies. The seats were arranged in a semicircle around the console, each equipped with harnesses and oxygen masks. As the climber accelerated, the view through the observation windows began to change. The Ascension complex shrank beneath us, its geometric symmetry giving way to the uneven patchwork of the surrounding landscape. Beyond that, the curvature of the Earth became increasingly apparent, a reminder of just how far we had to go. For a while, we sat in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Anya Bennett broke the silence first. She'd been fiddling with her camera, adjusting its settings to capture the ascent. "This is historic," she said, her voice tinged with genuine awe. "Imagine what this will mean for future generations." "Assuming it works," George Doyle muttered. The construction foreman's tone was gruff but not hostile. He'd spent more time on the spire than any of us, overseeing its assembly. If anyone understood its flaws, it was him. Trip Weston, seated next to George, smirked. "Relax, old man. If this thing can handle me, it can handle anything." "This isn't one of your experimental jets," George shot back. "You crash one of those, you eject. You crash this and we're all scrap." "Enough," Mason Huntley said quietly. The former Special Forces operative hadn't spoken much since we boarded, but his voice carried weight. The tension between Trip and George dissipated, replaced by an uneasy calm. Mason's presence had that effect, a silent reminder of the consequences of losing control. I focused on the diagnostics, tapping a nervous rhythm against the armrest of my seat. Everything looked stable, power output steady, cabin pressure nominal, magnetic alignment within acceptable parameters. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we were tempting fate. The Spire was a marvel of engineering, but it was also untested. And untested systems had a way of revealing their flaws at the worst possible moments. "How's it looking, Walker?" Dr. Lionel Koresh asked. The astrophysicist's voice carried a note of curiosity, though his expression remained impassive. "So far, so good," I replied. "Let's hope it stays that way." Koresh nodded, his gaze shifting to the observation window. "The magnetic alignment is holding," he said, almost to himself. "Remarkable. I'd have expected more drift at this altitude." The first leg of the journey took us through the Earth's troposphere, the lowest layer of the atmosphere. The climb was steady, the cabin systems compensating for the changing pressure and temperature. Outside, the sky deepened from pale blue to a richer, darker hue. By the time we reached the stratosphere, the clouds had thinned, giving way to a clearer view of the horizon. Its beauty was beyond explanation, illustrating the delicate and grand nature of the world we were about to depart. Hensley took the opportunity to deliver a speech. He rose from his seat, his hands clasped behind his back, and addressed the group with the practiced charisma of a man who'd spent decades commanding rooms. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what we're experiencing right now is more than just a technological achievement. It's a turning point for humanity." He paused, glancing at each of us as if gauging our reactions, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture of rehearsed gravitas. "For centuries, we've dreamed of reaching the stars. Today, we're not just dreaming, we're building the bridge." The speech was predictable, filled with grandiose declarations about progress and legacy. I tuned out after the first few sentences, my attention returning to the diagnostics. But not everyone was so dismissive. Anya recorded the entire speech, her camera trained on Hensley as he spoke. Trip leaned back in his seat, a grin plastered across his face. George's expression was harder to read, though he didn't seem particularly impressed. When Hensley finished, there was a smattering of polite applause. He returned to his seat, looking pleased with himself. I glanced at the diagnostic screens again, half expecting some new anomaly to appear, but everything remained stable. The cabin settled into a rhythm as we climbed higher. Anya interviewed George about his role in the Spire's construction, while Trip regaled Koresh with tales of his test pilot exploits. It wasn't until we reached the thermosphere that things started to go wrong. One of the diagnostic screens briefly scrambled with lines of static before returning to normal. At first, I thought it was a glitch. a minor issue with the display rather than the system itself. But then it happened again, accompanied by an uneven vibration that rippled through the cabin. "What was that?" Anya asked, her voice sharp with alarm. "Probably nothing," Hensley said quickly, "just a minor fluctuation." I frowned, running a diagnostic. The power output was stable, but there was a slight deviation in the magnetic alignment. It was small, barely outside the acceptable range, but it shouldn't have been there at all. "Walker?" Koresh prompted, his tone more curious than concerned. "We've got a slight misalignment in the magnetic track," I said. "Nothing critical, but I'll keep an eye on it." George leaned forward. "Slight misalignments don't just happen. What's causing it?" "Could be a lot of things," I replied. "Thermal expansion, electromagnetic interference, a minor calibration issue. It's probably nothing." "Probably," George repeated, his tone making it clear he didn't find the reassurance convincing. A sharp, stuttering vibration rattled through the cabin, cutting through the tense atmosphere like a sudden exhale from the spire itself. The diagnostic screens flashed again, their displays momentarily disrupted by static, before returning to normal. Mason unbuckled his harness and rose from his seat, his movements controlled but tense. "Sit down," Hensley said. "There's no reason to panic." "I'm not panicking," Mason replied evenly. "I'm assessing." The cabin lurched violently. The lights died, plunging us into momentary darkness before the emergency systems kicked in. Alarms blared from the console, and the diagnostic screens lit up with red warnings. The magnetic alignment had failed completely, leaving the climber suspended in mid-ascent. Worse, the power output was fluctuating wildly, threatening to overload the cabin's systems. Koresh leaned over my shoulder, his face pale. "Can you stabilize it?" "I'm trying," I snapped. Sweat dripped down my forehead as I rerouted power to the primary stabilizers. The cabin's vibrations subsided, but the alarms continued to blare. George unbuckled his harness and joined me at the console. "Tell me what you need," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "Monitor the pressure levels," I said. "If they spike, we've got bigger problems." As George worked, I scanned the diagnostics for any sign of what had caused the failure. The data was chaotic, a jumble of conflicting readouts that made no sense. The vibration gave way to a faint, rhythmic tapping, like a distant knock. It came from the direction of the observation windows, though the source was obscured by the darkness outside. Anya turned toward the sound, her face drained of color. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "It's just the cabin settling," Hensley said. The tapping intensified, refusing to stop. Tripp unbuckled his harness and approached the window, his movements hesitant. He peered into the void, his breath fogging the glass. "There's nothing out there," he said, though he sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. The lights dimmed again, and the tapping escalated into loud, resonant knocking. It felt as though the entire cabin was being crushed by an unseen force. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The cabin was unnervingly quiet. I scanned the diagnostic screens, but the data was no less chaotic than it had been moments ago. The climber had gone dead in the magnetic track, suspended as though held in place by an unseen hand. The systems weren't responding, leaving us stranded miles above the earth with no contact from the ground and no clear path forward. "I thought this thing was supposed to be foolproof," George muttered. His face was set in a grim scowl as he leaned closer to one of the displays. "Foolproof doesn't mean infallible," I replied. Mason stood near the cabin door, his posture rigid as he surveyed the group. His gaze darted between us like he was cataloguing potential weaknesses. "We need to figure out what caused that," he said, "before it happens again." "It's not a system failure," Koresh said from his seat, his tone analytical. "At least, not entirely. That noise wasn't mechanical. It was something else." "Something else? Like what? Ghosts?" Tripp snapped, his tone half joking, though his face betrayed his unease. He hadn't been able to sit still since the climber had halted, pacing the length of the cabin like a caged animal. "I don't know," Koresh admitted, "but it was external. Something out there." Anya had been recording everything, her camera capturing both the cabin and the passengers. Now she adjusted her lens toward the observation window as she peered into the void. "I don't like this," she murmured. "I don't like this at all." A sharp, grating noise echoed through the cabin, a high-pitched scrape that set my teeth on edge. It sounded like metal dragged across the glass, drawn out in slow, deliberate strokes. The noise came from the observation windows, though the reinforced glass revealed nothing but the suffocating blackness beyond. "Jesus Christ!" George hissed, backing away from the window. "What is that?" The sound stopped abruptly, leaving behind an almost oppressive silence. I forced myself to approach the window, my breath fogging the glass as I leaned closer. There were scratches on the outside surface, long, parallel lines etched into the glass as if by claws, unbelievably precise given the vacuum beyond. "Scratches," I muttered, "on the outside of the window." "That's not possible," Koresh said, though he sounded more intrigued than skeptical. "The material, it's designed to withstand micrometeoroids, high-speed fragments. Nothing should be able to—" "Well, it did," George cut in. "So what the hell are we dealing with?" Tripp's pacing quickened, his movements erratic. This is bullshit. This is some kind of sick joke. They're messing with us, right? The ground team? Some kind of test." "No one's messing with us," Mason said firmly. "Calm down." A distant whisper drifted through the cabin. At first, it was almost impossible to hear, a disjointed noise that might have been confused with static. But as it intensified, the words became clearer, though they were distorted and broken like a recording played backward. "Walker, you knew this would happen." I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The voice was mine, but twisted, stripped of any humanity. My stomach churned as the whisper faded, replaced by an eerie quiet that seemed to press down on all of us. "Did anyone else hear that?" I asked. The others were staring at me, their faces showing both confusion and fear. "Your voice," Anya said, her own voice trembling slightly. It said your name." George stepped closer to the console. "What's going on, Walker? What aren't you telling us?" I started to reply, but another sound interrupted me. This time, it was a low, echoing groan, as though the spire was straining under an immense weight. I heard someone, Tripp maybe, mutter a curse under their breath. Koresh was at the window now, his face pressed close to the glass. "There's something moving out there," he said. "What?" Mason asked, stepping toward him. Koresh didn't respond immediately. His hand was shaking as he pointed to a spot just beyond the window. It was there. I saw it. Something huge, but it's gone now." Tripp barked a nervous laugh. "Great, now we're seeing things. Fantastic." But I felt it too. The inexplicable weight of being watched, the sense that something was just out of sight, observing us. I scanned the diagnostic screens again in the hopes of finding some rational explanation. But the data was still incomprehensible, as though the systems themselves were breaking down under the strain of whatever was happening. The next anomaly came as a smell. It hit suddenly and without warning, a cloying stench that filled the cabin like a wave. It was thick and nauseating, a blend of rotting vegetation and decaying flesh. The others reacted immediately, coughing and gagging as they tried to shield their noses. "Where the hell is that coming from?" George asked, his voice muffled by the sleeve he'd pressed to his face. "There's nothing here," Anya whispered. "It doesn't make sense." I ran another diagnostic, searching for any indication of a chemical leak or contamination. But the cabin's life support system showed no abnormalities. The smell shouldn't have been possible, and yet it lingered, clinging to the air like an invisible miasma. Mason moved methodically, checking the storage compartments and ventilation grates. "No source," he said finally. "It's just there." The smell began to fade after several minutes. No one spoke for a long time. When the silence was finally broken, it was by Koresh, who was still staring out the window. "The reflections," he said. "They're not right." I turned to look at him, frowning. "What do you mean?" "The reflections," he repeated, gesturing to the glass. They're not right. Look. Reluctantly, I approached the window, my gaze shifting to the reflections of the cabin's interior. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The shapes of the passengers were discernible, mirroring their real counterparts. But as I watched, something changed. The reflections moved out of sync, lagging behind our movements or lingering too long after someone had turned away. Worse, the reflections' faces didn't match our expressions. They stared back at us with empty eyes and twisted smiles, their features warped and wrong. "God," Anya whispered, backing away from the window. "What is this? What's happening to us?" No one had an answer. The reflections remained as they were, distorted and unrelenting, a cruel mockery of our reality. "This isn't possible," Koresh muttered, his voice shaking. "None of this is possible." "We need to stay calm," Mason said, though even he sounded uncertain. "We'll figure this out. There has to be an explanation." The reflections in the observation windows continued their grotesque pantomime, out of sync and unblinking. Occasionally, one of them would seem to look directly at me, holding my gaze for a fraction too long before twisting into something I didn't recognize. I stopped glancing at them altogether. The first sign of change came when the diagnostic screens came back to life. It was sudden and without fanfare, the harsh green and red lines of data cutting through the dim cabin. "Power fluctuations stabilizing," I said aloud, though my voice sounded distant even to my own ears. "Magnetic alignment, partially restored." George straightened in his seat. "Does that mean we can move?" "It means we might have a chance. The controls are responding, but the system is fragile." "What do we need to do?" Mason asked. "Manual override," I replied. "We'll need to bypass the automated systems and reinitialize the climber's descent protocols." Koresh, who had been silent for most of the ordeal, spoke up. "I'll assist. Just tell me where to start." The others fell into a tense, focused silence as I directed Koresh and George to help me with the console. Mason kept watch near the observation windows, his posture stiff and alert. Anya remained seated, her camera abandoned on the floor beside her. "We're close," I muttered, as the final override sequence loaded onto the screen. "One last step." Before I could finish, the cabin was filled with a sharp, deafening screech. It was like the scraping sound from earlier, but amplified tenfold. A violent noise that echoed through every surface. I covered my ears, gritting my teeth as the noise became unbearable. Then it stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, plunging us into a silence so complete it felt unnatural. The lights steadied, dim but functional. I glanced at the others. They looked as shaken as I felt. My eyes were drawn to the scratches on the reinforced glass of the observation windows. They had deepened, their edges now visible even in the dim light. "Focus," Mason said, his tone snapping me back to the task at hand. "Get us moving." I forced myself back to the console and initiated the manual descent protocol. The climber shuddered, the vibrations rippling through the cabin as the motors groaned to life. The cabin began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. "It's working," I said, exhaling a breath. "We're descending." The relief was felt by all, though no one dared to celebrate. The climb down was far from smooth. The climber's systems groaned and protested, the diagnostics fluctuating wildly. Outside the windows, the darkness seemed to shift and ripple, as though the void itself were alive. I avoided looking directly at it, focusing instead on the console and the delicate balancing act required to keep the descent stable. The strange phenomena continued, though they had taken on a more insidious quality. The reflections in the windows became more distorted, their movements increasingly disconnected from our own. At one point, I saw my reflection turn to face me, its eyes wide and accusing, its mouth forming words I couldn't hear. The smell returned, sharper and more pervasive than before. This time it wasn't confined to a single area. It filled the entire cabin, thick and oppressive, making it difficult to breathe. Anya gagged, covering her mouth and nose with her sleeve. Even Mason, stoic as ever, grimaced as he fought to maintain his composure. The diagnostics were holding steady, but the strain on the climber's systems was evident. If we pushed too hard, we risked catastrophic failure. Finally, the climber broke through the lower layers of the atmosphere. The blackness outside began to give way to traces of light, the curvature of the earth becoming visible once more. Relief washed over me, though it was tempered by exhaustion and lingering fear. We weren't safe yet, but we were closer. The climber shook violently as it approached the base of the spire. I gritted my teeth, my hands gripping the console as I fought to stabilize the descent. Finally, with a jarring thud, the climber came to a halt. We had made it. For a second, no one moved. Then, one by one, we unbuckled our harnesses and rose from our seats. The reflections in the windows had stopped moving, but the scratches on the walls remained, silent witnesses to our ordeal. The hatch opened, and fresh air rushed in, dispelling the stench that had plagued us. I stepped out onto the platform, my legs shaky but functional. The others followed, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief. We were alive, but none of us would ever be the same. In the weeks that followed, the Ascension Spire was shut down indefinitely. The sprawling complex that once buzzed with engineers and media crews now stood silent, a skeletal monument to what could have been humanity's greatest triumph. Official investigations were swift but perfunctory. Hensley Dynamics issued a carefully worded statement, attributing the incident to a cascade of technical failures triggered by unanticipated environmental anomalies. The press ate it up, eager for an explanation that fit within the bounds of human understanding. Hensley himself stood at the podium during the press conference, his face a mask of solemnity. "This was a tragic but invaluable learning experience," he said, his voice authoritative. "We now have the data necessary to ensure this never happens again. The Ascension Spire is a symbol of hope, and we will rebuild better, stronger." The words sounded hollow to me as I watched them from a safe distance. The others, those of us who had been there, avoided the cameras, our silence more damning than any statement we could have made. George Doyle, the foreman who had poured his blood and sweat into the spire's construction, quit his job and disappeared from public view. Rumors swirled that he had returned to his small hometown, where he now spent his days restoring old machines in a dusty workshop. Some said he refused to speak about the spire, while others claimed he muttered about patterns in the walls to anyone who got too close. I tried to reach out to him once, but he never returned my messages. Trip Weston, the cocky test pilot, didn't fare much better. The experience had shaken him to his core, stripping away the bravado that once defined him. He disappeared from the public eye entirely, though tabloids occasionally published photos of him in dingy bars, nursing drinks alone. The last I heard, he was living in a trailer park near a small airstrip, offering flying lessons to kids who didn't know or care about his past. Dr. Lionel Koresh had always been eccentric, but the incident pushed him further into obsession. He devoted himself to deciphering the phenomena we'd experienced, publishing paper after paper filled with theories that oscillated between brilliance and madness. Academic circles began to distance themselves from him, his name whispered with equal parts respect and pity. The last of his emails to me were nearly incoherent, filled with cryptic diagrams and references to things beneath the quantum horizon. I stopped responding, though part of me regrets it. Mason Huntley remained the most composed of all of us, at least outwardly. He returned to his work in private security, though his assignments became more selective and his presence more withdrawn. I saw him once, at a small cafe in the city. He acknowledged me with a nod, but didn't stop to talk. His eyes, always sharp and calculating, carried a haunted edge that hadn't been there before. Anya Bennett took a sabbatical from journalism. When we met weeks after the descent, she was visibly different, her confident demeanor replaced with nervous energy, as if she were constantly looking over her shoulder. She spoke about the whispers, the reflections, the stench that clung to her even after she'd left the spire. As for Gregory Hensley, He emerged from the ordeal seemingly unscathed, his image carefully maintained by his public relations team. Yet rumors circulated among his inner circle, whispers that he was no longer sleeping, that he'd ordered the interior of his penthouse stripped of any reflective surfaces. Some said he had installed floodlights that kept every corner of his home bathed in light at all times. When I saw him on TV, delivering yet another speech about humanity's resilience, his eyes looked empty, as though he were staring into a void no one else could see. As for me, I left Hensley Dynamics and the field of engineering entirely. I couldn't bring myself to design again, not after what happened. I took a quiet job teaching at a local technical college, far removed from the high-stakes world of innovation. But the spire lingers in my mind, a shadow that never quite leaves. The spire may be silent, its systems powered down, but in the darkest hours I can feel it calling, pulling at me with the same unseen force that almost took us. And I wonder if it's waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to try again.